My name is Cassandra Morgan, 32, and I never thought I'd see the day when my father would slam the door in my face and say, "Don't come back." All I wanted was to protect my sister from his manipulative business partner. When I revealed those financial documents showing the embezzlement at our family gathering, everyone sided with Dad despite clear evidence. The next morning, I made the hardest decision, cutting off my entire family and walking away from our family business. But 6 months later, Dad showed up at my apartment with tears in his eyes and a confession that changed everything. I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If this family drama resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. Trust me, you'll want to hear how karma finally came for my father's business partner. To understand why my father's words cut so deep that night, you need to know about the Morgan family business empire. Morgan Construction was founded by my grandfather William Morgan over 50 years ago. What started as a small residential construction company became one of the largest commercial contractors in the Northeast under my father's leadership. Dad, Richard Morgan, took over at 30 when Grandpa stepped back, transforming a mid-sized company into an empire spanning 3 states. Dad was always the domineering CEO type, both at the office and at home. Every dinner conversation revolved around business. Every family vacation included property inspections. Every achievement was measured against its value to the Morgan legacy. My mother, Eleanor, played the perfect corporate wife and family peacemaker. Beautiful, gracious, and unfailingly supportive, she'd smooth over Dad's harshness with gentle words and soothing touches. "Your father just wants what's best," she'd say after he'd tear into one of us for some perceived failure. Mom always deferred to Dad on anything important. In 40 years of marriage, I never once heard her directly contradict him. Then there was my sister Melanie, 27, the golden child. Despite her marketing degree from a second-tier school and minimal work experience, she held the title of marketing director at Morgan Construction. Dad gave her the position 2 years ago, bypassing several qualified candidates. Melanie had our father's charm, but none of his work ethic. She'd show up late to meetings, leave early for shopping trips, and somehow receive praise for the work her subordinates completed. My brother Brandon, 30, occupied the uncomfortable middle position. The dutiful son who worked 60-hour weeks in operations, but never quite earned Dad's approval. Brandon had our father's business instincts, but lacked his ruthless edge. I'd sometimes catch a look of quiet desperation on his face during particularly cutthroat business discussions. He'd confided in me once that he'd rather be playing music in a band than scrutinizing contractor bids, but he'd never dare tell Dad that. And then there was me, the responsible oldest daughter with an MBA from Wharton. I'd spent my entire life preparing to eventually take over the business. Since childhood, I'd been the serious one, the planner, the one who made straight A's, and turned down parties to study business journals. I worked my way up through every department, learning the business inside and out. Dad had been grooming me for the CEO position, or so I thought. Our family had always prioritized business over relationships. When Brandon missed his senior recital to attend an emergency board meeting, Dad called it learning priorities. When Melanie's high school boyfriend was deemed unsuitable because his family wasn't in our social circle, Mom explained it as protecting her prospects. When I postponed my wedding indefinitely because we were acquiring a competitor, everyone agreed it was the responsible choice. My fiancé didn't agree and left shortly after. Dad called it separating the wheat from the chaff. The only person who seemed to understand the importance of balance was my grandfather. Even after retiring, he'd visit the office weekly, not to check the numbers, but to chat with the employees, remember their children's names, ask about their lives outside work. He taught me that integrity in business mattered above all. "Buildings fall, Cassie," he'd say, using my childhood nickname, "but your good name stands forever." When Grandpa was dying 3 years ago, he asked to speak with me alone. Holding my hand with surprising strength for someone so frail, he made me promise to protect what matters most. I thought he meant the business, but now I wonder if he meant something else entirely. Everything started changing about a year ago when Kenneth Barrett, my father's business partner and lifelong friend, began gaining unusual influence in company decisions. Kenneth had been with the company almost as long as Dad, but always in a secondary position. Suddenly, he was weighing in on areas outside his expertise, attending meetings he'd previously skipped, and spending unusual amounts of time closed away with my father. I first noticed financial irregularities while reviewing quarterly reports. Construction materials for the Westfield project costing 40% above market rate. Consulting fees to companies I'd never heard of. Cash flow discrepancies that couldn't be easily explained. Meanwhile, Kenneth showed up in a new Maserati, bought a vacation home in Aspen, and mentioned offhand that his son had been accepted to a prestigious private school in Switzerland. Something wasn't adding up, and my father, usually meticulous about finances, seemed deliberately oblivious. That's when I started digging deeper. My suspicions about the company's finances grew stronger each day. Kenneth's sudden display of wealth seemed incongruous with his salary, even accounting for bonuses. He'd always lived well, but the Maserati, the Aspen property, and the Swiss school weren't just steps up, they were leaps into a new financial stratosphere. I started staying late at the office, long after everyone else had gone home. The quiet gave me space to think, to review financial records without interruption or suspicious glances. I created a spreadsheet tracking unusual expenditures, cross-referencing them with project timelines and Kenneth's increasingly lavish lifestyle. 3 weeks into my investigation, I discovered the first shell company, Westland Consulting Group. It had received over $2 million in strategic advisory fees during the past year, yet I couldn't find any deliverables, reports, or evidence of work performed. The corporate address led to a virtual office space in Delaware. Digging deeper, I found 3 more entities: Barrett International Holdings, Morgan Barrett Acquisitions, and Eagle Point Enterprises, all receiving substantial payments from Morgan Construction for vague services, all with minimal online presence, all connected through a complex web of paperwork to Kenneth Barrett. My father's signature appeared on all the authorization forms. This wasn't happening behind his back. He was actively participating. But why? Dad had built this company with relentless dedication. He'd sacrificed family time, personal interests, everything for Morgan Construction. It made no sense for him to siphon money from his own legacy, unless he wasn't doing this willingly. I remembered occasional tensions between Dad and Kenneth over the years, moments when Kenneth would make oblique references to that situation in Pittsburgh, and Dad's expression would turn stony. Was there something in their past that Kenneth was using as leverage? The deeper I dug, the worse it got. I discovered that Melanie had been named as a director of Eagle Point Enterprises 6 months ago. My sister, who could barely manage her own department, was supposedly overseeing a company receiving hundreds of thousands in consulting fees. Did she know what was happening, or was she an unwitting pawn? I decided to approach Brandon. Of all the family members, he was the most likely to listen without immediately running to Dad. We met at a coffee shop far from the office, away from familiar faces. "I've found something concerning," I said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. Brandon stirred his coffee with unusual focus. If this is about the Westfield cost overruns, Dad already approved the additional budget. It's bigger than that. I slid a folder across the table. Someone stealing from the company. A lot of money. He glanced at the papers without touching them. "Cassie, maybe this isn't something we should get involved in." "Not get involved? It's our family business." Brandon looked around nervously. "You don't understand. There are complicated factors at play." "Like what? What could possibly justify millions being funneled out of our company?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "Dad has his reasons. Just trust that he knows what he's doing." "You know about this?" I felt sick. "Not details, just enough to know we should stay out of it." He pushed the folder back toward me. "For your own good, Cassie, let it go." But I couldn't. 2 days later, I overheard a conversation that chilled me to the bone. I was working late again when voices drifted from the executive lounge. Kenneth and Melanie, speaking in hushed tones. "Your father's getting nervous," Kenneth said. "You need to keep him calm." "I'm trying," Melanie replied, sounding stressed in a way I rarely heard from my carefree sister. But Cassandra's asking questions. She knows something's wrong, then distract her. Isn't that what you're good at? Creating diversions? This is different. She's like a dog with a bone when she thinks something's wrong. Well, figure it out. We're too close to stop now. Another 6 months and we're home free. Then Kenneth's voice softened, took on a tone I'd never heard him use with my sister before. Don't worry, sweetheart. Soon we won't have to hide anymore. Sweetheart? The pieces clicked into horrifying place. My sister and Kenneth, a married man 30 years her senior, were involved, and somehow connected to the financial fraud. I slipped away before they could discover me, my mind racing. Kenneth wasn't just stealing from the company, he'd somehow entangled my sister in his schemes. Was he using her? Was she a willing participant? Either way, she was in danger of going down with him when this inevitably collapsed. The next day, I made a decision that crossed a line. I waited until Kenneth had a meeting across town, then used the master key I'd borrowed from facilities to enter his office. 20 minutes of searching revealed a hidden compartment in his desk containing a flash drive. Back in my office, with the door locked, I discovered the drive contained meticulous records of the fraud, much more extensive than I'd initially uncovered. But also something else. Old emails between Kenneth and my father referencing a construction site accident in Pittsburgh 15 years ago. Something about falsified safety inspections and payoffs to prevent investigations. Was this Kenneth's leverage? Some past mistake my father had made that Kenneth had helped cover up, only to use against him years later? I sat at my desk, staring at the evidence before me, facing an impossible ethical dilemma. Loyalty to my family versus doing what was right, protecting the company legacy versus exposing the truth, warning my sister versus reporting a crime. Grandpa's words echoed in my mind. Protect what matters most. I made copies of everything and decided I would confront my father directly at the annual family business dinner the following evening. Surely once he saw the evidence, he would do the right thing. I couldn't have been more wrong. The annual family business dinner was a Morgan tradition dating back to my grandfather's time. Once a year, family members involved in the business would gather at my parents' mansion to celebrate achievements, discuss future plans, and reinforce our dynasty's continuation. This year's event took on an ominous significance as I arrived with my portfolio of evidence tucked under my arm. The house looked the same as always. Imposing colonial architecture, perfectly manicured grounds, the Morgan construction flag flying alongside the American flag. Inside, caterers arranged hors d'oeuvres while my mother directed the placement of fresh flower arrangements. Everything perfect, everything controlled, everything for show. Cassandra, darling. Mom air-kissed both my cheeks. You look tired. Are you sleeping enough? I'm fine, Mom. Just been working on something important. Well, put work aside tonight. Your father has a special announcement. My stomach tightened. What kind of announcement? It's not my place to say. Her practiced smile revealed nothing. Kenneth and his wife arrived early. They're with your father in the study. Kenneth had brought his wife. The same wife he was betraying with my sister. The hypocrisy made me nauseous. Dinner began with the usual formalities. Dad at the head of the table, Mom at the foot. Brandon, Melanie, Kenneth and his wife Helen, and several key executives filled in between. I sat directly opposite Kenneth, watching him charm everyone with stories and jokes as if he weren't systematically looting our company. A toast. Kenneth raised his glass midway through the meal. To the Morgan family and Morgan Construction, where loyalty and family always come first. The irony was suffocating. After the main course, Dad stood for his annual address. He began with the usual platitudes about growth and vision, then moved to the special announcement Mom had mentioned. After 35 years of building this company together, I'm pleased to announce that Kenneth Barrett will be joining me as equal partner in Morgan Construction. Polite applause around the table. Kenneth beamed. Additionally, Dad continued, I'm promoting Melanie to Executive Vice President of Client Relations, reporting directly to Kenneth and myself. My sister's face flushed with pleasure as congratulations flowed. I noticed she carefully avoided looking at Kenneth's wife. Dad, I interrupted, before we continue, I need to speak with you privately." He frowned at the breach of protocol. "Whatever you need to say can wait until after dinner, Cassandra." "I don't think it can." "Then say it here. We're all family." It wasn't how I wanted this to happen, but he'd left me no choice. "I've discovered some concerning financial irregularities in the company." I opened my portfolio. Specifically, millions of dollars being funneled to shell companies connected to Kenneth. The room went silent. Kenneth's smile didn't waver. "That's a serious accusation," Dad said coldly. "It's not an accusation, it's a fact." I began passing documents around the table. "These companies don't provide actual services. They exist solely to siphon money from Morgan Construction." Kenneth chuckled. "Richard, your daughter has quite an imagination. These are legitimate strategic partnerships. Perhaps if she'd attended the executive planning sessions instead of conducting her little investigation, she'd understand their purpose." "I wasn't invited to those sessions," I countered. "Convenient, isn't it?" Dad hadn't looked at the documents. He stared straight at me. "What exactly are you implying, Cassandra?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Kenneth is embezzling from the company with your signature on the paperwork, and he's somehow involved Melanie in his schemes." Melanie gasped. "How dare you? You're just jealous because Dad trusts me enough for a real leadership position." "Leadership?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're a figurehead director of a shell company. Eagle Point Enterprises exists to launder money from our family business. You've always been jealous of me." Melanie's voice rose hysterically. "Always trying to ruin anything good that happens to me." Kenneth placed a calming hand on my sister's arm. The familiarity of the gesture wasn't lost on me, though others might have missed it. "Richard," Kenneth said smoothly, "I think we both know what's happening here. Cassandra expected to be named your successor. When she realized that might not happen, she concocted this elaborate story." "That's not true," I insisted. "Dad, just look at the evidence. The money trail is clear." Dad finally picked up one of the documents, glanced at it dismissively, then set it aside. "These partnerships were established with my full knowledge and approval. If you had concerns, you should have come to me privately, instead of creating this spectacle." "I tried. You've been unavailable every time I've attempted to speak with you for weeks, because I've been finalizing the partnership agreement with Kenneth. An agreement that, frankly, your behavior tonight makes me even more confident in." Mom interjected, her voice quavering slightly. "Please, everyone, let's not ruin our special evening with unpleasantness. Cassandra, perhaps you've been working too hard." "This isn't about me being overworked, Mom. This is about our family business being stolen from under our noses." Brandon stared at his plate, saying nothing. The executives looked uncomfortable, clearly wishing to be anywhere else. "Enough." Dad slammed his hand on the table, making the crystal water glasses jump. "You've always been stubborn, Cassandra, but I never thought you'd stoop to attacking family out of professional jealousy." "Jealousy? Dad, look at the Pittsburgh emails. Kenneth is blackmailing you about whatever happened there." Something dark flashed across my father's face. For a moment, I thought I'd broken through. Then Kenneth spoke. "Richard, I believe Cassandra accessed my private office without authorization. That flash drive contained confidential information about client relationships. I'd call that corporate espionage." "Is this true?" Dad asked. I hesitated just a second too long. "The means don't invalidate what I found." Dad stood up slowly, his expression hardening. "Kenneth is right. This is about your ambition, your need to control everything, your inability to accept that others might be better suited for leadership than you." "Better suited? Kenneth is a thief, and Melanie is either his accomplice or his victim." Melanie burst into tears. "See how she treats me? She's always hated me." Mom rushed to comfort her while glaring at me reproachfully. "You've gone too far," Dad said. Each word fell like a stone. "You've insulted my judgment, invaded a colleague's privacy, and accused your sister of criminal activity. All because you can't stand not being the center of attention." "That's not true," I said, but my voice sounded small even to my own ears. Dad pointed toward the door. "I think you should leave." "Dad, please, just read the documents." "Leave!" He roared the word, And don't come back until you're ready to apologize to everyone at this table." The silence that followed was absolute. I looked around at the faces. Kenneth's smug satisfaction, Melanie's theatrical tears, Brandon's studied neutrality, Mom's disappointed embarrassment, the executive's uncomfortable avoidance. No one was going to stand with me. No one was even going to consider the possibility I might be right. I gathered my documents with shaking hands. "You'll regret this." As I walked out, past the family portraits lining the hallway, 4 generations of Morgans who built something from nothing, I heard my father's final words. "Don't come back, Cassandra. You're no longer welcome in this house or at Morgan Construction." The heavy front door closed behind me with terrible finality. The drive home passed in a blur. Tears streamed down my face as I navigated familiar streets that suddenly seemed alien. 20 minutes into the drive, I had to pull onto the highway shoulder, my hands shaking too badly to continue. The evening replayed in my mind like a nightmare. How had everything gone so wrong? I'd been so certain that once I presented the evidence, Dad would see the truth. Instead, I'd been cast out, disowned. In the silent car, memories surfaced of other times when my family had chosen money and appearances over ethics. The whistleblower employee who'd been fired after raising safety concerns, Dad calling him disloyal despite his valid points. The time we discovered a subcontractor using substandard materials, and rather than report them, we simply stopped using them and kept quiet. The community center project where we'd knowingly underbid, planning to make up costs with change orders, a practice that bordered on fraud but was justified as industry standard. Each time, I'd expressed misgivings. Each time, I'd been told I was being naive, that business required compromise. Each time, I'd eventually fallen in line. But Grandpa never would have compromised like that. I remembered him firing a project manager who tried to bribe a building inspector, despite the manager's stellar performance record. "Character is what you do when no one's looking," he'd told me afterward. "And someone's always looking, even if it's just yourself in the mirror." What would he say now, seeing his company used as a personal piggy bank, seeing his son involved in something so corrupt, seeing his granddaughter cast out for trying to protect the Morgan name? I drove the rest of the way home in a daze. My apartment, a luxury high-rise owned by a Morgan Construction subsidiary, suddenly felt precarious. How long before they evicted me? Sleep was impossible. I paced until sunrise, weighing my options, running scenarios. By morning, clarity had emerged from the emotional storm. I couldn't continue enabling my family's corruption. Not anymore. Not after seeing how deep it went. Not after being forced to choose between truth and family loyalty. At my desk, I drafted a formal resignation letter. Professional, detailed, but without accusations. This wasn't about creating a paper trail of allegations. It was about cleanly severing my connection to Morgan Construction. Before sending it, I called Professor Diane Carter from business school. She'd been a mentor since my MBA days, the rare teacher who emphasized ethics alongside profit margins. "They've made their choice, Cassandra," she said after I explained the situation. "Now you need to make yours." "I already have," I replied. "I'm resigning today." "Good. But you need to consider whether simply walking away is enough." I knew what she was asking. "You mean, report them? The behavior you're describing is criminal. If Kenneth Barrett is embezzling company funds with your father's knowledge, that's conspiracy to commit fraud. Reporting them would destroy the company. Hundreds of people would lose their jobs. And if you don't report them, the company implodes anyway when this scheme inevitably falls apart, possibly taking client funds with it. More people hurt, more damage done." She was right, of course. The longer the fraud continued, the worse the eventual fallout would be. That afternoon, I met with Samuel Torres, a financial crimes investigator with the State Attorney General's office. I brought copies of everything: bank transfers, shell company registrations, suspicious consulting agreements, the emails referencing Pittsburgh. "This will take time to investigate," Torres warned, "and your family will know someone reported them." "I understand." He studied me carefully. "Family businesses are complicated. Are you sure you want to do this?" I thought of Grandpa again, Protect what matters most. Yes, I said firmly. I'm sure. Walking out of Tora's office felt like setting down a heavy burden I'd carried too long. But new burdens quickly replaced it. Practical concerns I'd never had to worry about before. First, I blocked all family members' numbers and social media accounts. I couldn't bear their calls or messages, couldn't risk being manipulated back into the fold. Next, I packed essential belongings from my apartment and placed everything else in storage. Within 48 hours, I'd found a small furnished rental across town, paid 6 months in advance from my savings. The final task was hardest, rebuilding an identity separate from the Morgan legacy. For 32 years, I'd been Cassandra Morgan of Morgan Construction. My education, my career path, my social circle, even my romantic relationships had all been shaped by that identity. Who was I without it? The first days of independence were brutal. Waking up in a strange apartment. No office to go to. No family calling. The silence was both liberating and terrifying. I began consulting for small businesses, focusing on those with strong ethical principles. A worker-owned landscaping cooperative. A sustainable building materials retailer. A minority-owned architecture firm. The work paid far less than my Morgan Construction salary, but brought a satisfaction I'd rarely felt before. Each small business owner I worked with reminded me of my grandfather in his early days. Hardworking, principled, building something meaningful. For the first time, I felt I was honoring his true legacy, not just the corporate empire that had grown from his humble start. I wonder if you've ever had to make a choice like mine, walking away from something that defined you, but compromised your values. Let me know in the comments if you've faced your own moment of truth. If you're enjoying this story of family betrayal and difficult choices, please hit that like button. Next, we'll see what 6 months of independence taught me, and the shocking moment that changed everything again. 6 months passed quickly in my new life. The woman who stared back at me from the mirror each morning looked similar to the Cassandra Morgan who had walked out of her father's mansion that fateful night, but she was fundamentally transformed. I'd established a small consulting firm specializing in business ethics and sustainable growth strategies. Morgan Integrity Consulting was a deliberate choice of name, reclaiming my family name while emphasizing the values I felt the family business had abandoned. My client list grew steadily through word of mouth. Small to medium businesses appreciated having access to Morgan-caliber business expertise without Morgan-level fees. My social circle transformed as well. Gone were the country club connections and society acquaintances who'd orbited the Morgan family sphere. In their place, I found authentic friendships with fellow entrepreneurs, local business owners, and community advocates. People who valued me for my ideas and character, not my family name or net worth. 3 months into my new life, I met Michael Chen at a small business networking event. He ran a sustainable construction company that specialized in affordable, energy-efficient housing. Unlike the luxury projects Morgan Construction pursued, Michael's company built homes people could actually afford, using environmentally responsible methods. We began dating cautiously. I didn't tell him about my family background immediately, wanting to be known for myself first. When I finally explained over dinner one night, his response surprised me. "I figured you came from money," he said with a shrug. "You have that private school posture, but I was more interested in where you're going than where you came from." With Michael, I experienced a relationship untainted by family expectations or business advantages. No one was calculating the strategic value of our connection or how our children might further the family dynasty. It was refreshingly simple. Two people who enjoyed each other's company and shared compatible values. Meanwhile, the wider world brought occasional news about Morgan Construction. A Business Journal article mentioned financial irregularities being investigated at the company. An industry newsletter noted that 3 major clients had suspended contracts pending internal reviews. The company website removed Kenneth's executive profile without explanation. I avoided directly seeking information, but news occasionally found me. Grace Wellington, an old family friend who'd always had a soft spot for me, called one afternoon. "I thought you should know," she said without preamble. "The company's in trouble. Your father won't admit it, but they've laid off 30 people already. The Westfield project is stalled, and that new hotel downtown is looking for another contractor. I'm sorry to hear that, I said carefully. Richard looks terrible, Cassandra. Whatever's happening is taking a toll. I thanked her for the information but didn't engage further. My emotions around my family remained too complex to discuss casually. A week later, I spotted Melanie at Café Laurent, a restaurant I frequented. She hadn't seen me, and I observed her from across the room. My glamorous, carefree sister looked haggard and stressed, checking her phone compulsively and jumping at small noises. When her lunch companion arrived, a severe-looking woman in a business suit, their conversation appeared tense and unpleasant. I left before Melanie could notice me, unsettled by her obvious distress, but not yet ready for a confrontation. More pieces of the puzzle emerged gradually. Shopping at Nordstrom, I glimpsed my mother across the department store, trying on a conservative black dress that might have been appropriate for a court appearance. She looked thinner, her shoulders hunched, her usually perfect hair showing signs of gray she'd previously never allowed. The sight of her aging visibly in just 6 months made my throat tighten with conflicting emotions. Through a former colleague who'd left Morgan Construction, I learned that Brandon had taken a leave of absence. Rumor had it he'd moved to Nashville temporarily, perhaps finally pursuing his musical interests. The most significant news came from an anonymous email that arrived 3 months after I'd left. The sender used an encrypted account and gave no identifying details, but the content suggested someone inside Morgan Construction or close to the investigation. Detailed information about Kenneth Barrett's offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Singapore, dates and amounts of major transfers, and connections to a network of other suspicious businesses. I forwarded the email to Investigator Torres without comment. He confirmed receipt with a brief message. "This helps. Thank you." By the 6-month mark, I had created a life that felt increasingly authentic. My business was stable, if not lavish. My relationship with Michael was deepening. I had an apartment that felt like mine, not a corporate perk. I'd even adopted a rescue cat named Chairman Meow, something my father would have considered frivolous and unprofessional. Yet beneath this new stability ran an undercurrent of unresolved emotion. In quiet moments, I found myself wondering about my family. Had Mom ever questioned Dad about the allegations I'd raised? Was Melanie still involved with Kenneth? Did Brandon regret not supporting me that night? And my father, was he a willing participant in Kenneth's schemes, or somehow a victim himself? The evening before my father's unexpected visit, I experienced what I can only describe as a premonition. Washing dishes after dinner, I suddenly dropped a glass, watching it shatter across the kitchen floor. For a moment, I stood frozen, overcome by a sense that something significant was about to change. Michael, who'd been drying dishes beside me, touched my shoulder gently. "You okay?" I nodded, unable to explain the feeling. "Just butterfingers." As we cleaned up the broken glass together, I couldn't shake the sensation of standing on a precipice. 6 months of carefully constructed independence suddenly felt provisional, temporary. That night, I dreamed of my grandfather's office, where he'd often let me play as a child. In the dream, he was sorting through papers, looking increasingly concerned. "Protect what matters most, Cassie," he said, just as he had on his deathbed. But this time he continued, "Remember, buildings fall, people remain." I woke with those words echoing in my mind, unsure of their meaning but certain they were important. The next morning, Saturday, the doorbell rang at 9:17 a.m. I wasn't expecting anyone, and Michael had left early for a job site. When I checked through the peephole, the last person I expected to see was standing in my hallway. My father. For several seconds, I simply stared through the peephole, convinced I was hallucinating. Richard Morgan stood in my hallway looking nothing like himself. My father had always been impeccably groomed, perfectly tailored, projecting power and confidence with every gesture. The man outside my door looked diminished somehow. His shoulders slumped beneath a wrinkled blazer. His face appeared gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes. He'd aged a decade in 6 months. My first instinct was to ignore the bell, Pretend I wasn't home. What could he possibly say that would make any difference now? But curiosity, and some deeper emotion I couldn't name, compelled me to unlock the door. "Dad," I said flatly. He flinched slightly at my tone. "Cassandra, may I come in?" I hesitated, then stepped aside wordlessly. Dad entered cautiously, surveying my modest apartment with an expression I couldn't read. Was it judgment? Surprise? Concern? The place was a far cry from the luxury high-rise I'd previously occupied or the mansion I'd grown up in. My furniture was mostly second-hand, chosen for comfort rather than status. Chairman Meow watched suspiciously from his perch on the bookshelf. "Nice place," Dad said awkwardly. "It suits you somehow. Why are you here?" I crossed my arms, maintaining distance. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, a nervous gesture I'd rarely seen from him. "I wanted to see how you're doing." "I'm doing fine." "Better than fine, actually." "Yes, I can see that." He gestured vaguely. "Your consulting business seems to be taking off. Morgan Integrity. Good name." A chill ran through me. "You've been checking up on me?" "Not spying, if that's what you're thinking. Just keeping tabs. Making sure you were okay." "I'm not a child, Dad. And I'm not your employee anymore. You don't get to monitor my life after telling me not to come back." He winced visibly at the reminder of his words. "I deserve that. I deserve worse, actually." The frank admission startled me into silence. "Could we sit?" he asked. "This conversation might take a while." Still wary, I directed him to the living room sofa and took the armchair opposite, maintaining the maximum distance the small room allowed. "You look well," he said, though his eyes noted the changes in me. The simpler clothing, the less formal hairstyle, the absence of the designer watch he'd given me for my 30th birthday. "You don't," I replied honestly. "You look terrible." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Always direct. "You get that from your grandfather." He leaned forward, clasping his hands between his knees. "Cassandra, I owe you an apology. The biggest one imaginable. You were right. About everything. Though I'd imagined this moment many times over the past months. The reality of hearing those words from my proud, stubborn father left me momentarily speechless." "Kenneth has been embezzling from the company," Dad continued, his voice flat. "The shell companies, the fake consulting contracts, all of it. Just as you discovered." "I know," I said quietly. "But you knew too. You signed the paperwork." Dad's gaze dropped to his hands. "Yes, but not willingly." He took a deep breath. "Kenneth has been blackmailing me for years. Despite my suspicions, hearing the confirmation sent a chill through me." "The Pittsburgh situation." Dad looked up sharply. "You know about Pittsburgh?" I saw references in the emails on Kenneth's flash drive. Something about falsified safety inspections? I couldn't access the full details. He closed his eyes briefly. 15 years ago, we were building that office complex in Pittsburgh. Major project, tight deadline, lots of pressure. We discovered structural issues that would have required extensive rework and months of delay. "And you covered it up," I guessed. "I convinced myself it wasn't that serious. The building would still be safe, just not quite up to the gold standard specifications we'd promised. I falsified inspection reports. Kenneth helped me." Dad's voice grew quieter. 3 months after completion, part of the parking structure collapsed. 2 maintenance workers were seriously injured. I felt sick. "Were you investigated?" "The official investigation found material fatigue to be the cause. No one looked deeper because Kenneth had taken care of certain inspectors. I told myself it was over, that we'd learned our lesson. But Kenneth kept evidence." Dad nodded grimly. "Photos, emails, the original inspection reports. He never threatened explicitly for years, just occasional reminders that he'd taken care of me in Pittsburgh. I was grateful, believed we'd protected each other." His laugh was bitter. 5 years ago, he showed me everything he'd kept. Said he was having financial troubles, needed some creative accounting to get through a divorce settlement. "So you helped him steal from your own company." "It started small. Consulting fees to a company his brother-in-law owned. Then more companies, bigger amounts. Each time I objected, he'd remind me about Pittsburgh, mention how devastated Mom would be if the truth came out. how the company would collapse, how you children would be tainted by my crimes. And Melanie? How did she get involved? Dad's expression darkened. Kenneth approached her about a year ago. Charming, attentive. Made her feel important, sophisticated. By the time I realized what was happening, he had her completely under his influence. When I confronted him, he just added it to his leverage. Now, it wasn't just my reputation at stake, but Melanie's future too. I processed this information, feeling conflicted. My father had committed serious ethical breaches, endangering lives, and then covering it up. Yet Kenneth's manipulation was even more calculated and malicious. "Why didn't you come to me?" I asked. "I could have helped." "You?" Dad looked genuinely surprised. "Cassandra, you're the most ethical person in our family. How could I admit to you that I'd violated everything I'd taught you about integrity in business? That I'd endangered people's lives to meet a deadline and protect profits? So instead you let me believe I was crazy? Let everyone treat me like a jealous, paranoid troublemaker? I was trapped. If I acknowledged you were right, everything would unravel. I convinced myself I was protecting the family, the company, the employees whose livelihoods depended on us." "What changed?" I asked. "Why are you here now?" Dad rubbed his face wearily. "Kenneth is gone. Disappeared 3 weeks ago. Emptied his accounts, took everything he could liquidate. We estimate he stole over $12 million in total." And Melanie? Devastated. He'd promised to leave his wife for her. Instead, he left everyone. Used her just like he used me. Dad's voice broke slightly. "I failed to protect her, just like I failed you." I felt a surge of anger. "So you're here because Kenneth betrayed you, not because you regret betraying me." "No!" Dad looked up sharply. "I'm here because I was wrong, because you were right all along and I was too proud and scared to listen, because losing you made me realize what really matters." His sincerity gave me pause. "What about the company?" "In trouble. I'm cooperating fully with investigators now, trying to salvage what we can, make amends where possible. He hesitated. It's going to mean significant personal consequences for me." "Legal consequences. You might go to jail," I said bluntly. Dad nodded. "The investigators have been clear about that possibility. The Pittsburgh cover-up alone. Well, the statute of limitations hasn't expired." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his confession filling the small room. "Brandon took a leave of absence," Dad continued eventually. "Said he needed space to think. He's in Nashville, finally pursuing that music dream he always had. He calls your mother but won't speak to me. And Mom? Not well. The stress has affected her health. She blames herself for never questioning me, for always supporting my decisions blindly." He hesitated. "She misses you terribly." Another silence fell between us. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Cassandra," Dad finally said. "I don't deserve it. I'm not even asking you to come back to the company or the family. His voice faltered. "I needed you to know you were right. That I know it. That I'm sorry for what I did to you." He stood up to leave, looking older and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. At the door, he turned back. "I've always been proud of you, Cassandra. Even when I couldn't admit it. You're the best of us. The most like your grandfather." He smiled sadly. "He always said you'd be the one to carry his true legacy. Not the buildings or the money, but the integrity." As the door closed behind him, I remained frozen in my chair, overwhelmed by emotions I couldn't immediately process. Everything I'd suspected had been confirmed, yet nothing felt resolved. My father had finally acknowledged the truth, but at what cost to everyone involved? The company was in crisis. My sister was heartbroken. My brother was in self-imposed exile. My mother was ill. My father faced potential criminal charges, and I sat alone in my apartment, vindicated but hollow. Chairman Meow jumped into my lap, his rumbling purr a counterpoint to my racing thoughts. As I stroked his fur automatically, my grandfather's words from my dream echoed in my mind. "Buildings fall. People remain." After my father left, I spent hours pacing my small apartment, trying to process everything he'd revealed. The validation of knowing I'd been right brought no satisfaction. Instead, I felt a complicated mix of anger, sympathy, and something like grief, not just for the family I'd lost, but for the family I'd thought we were. When Michael called that evening, I found myself pouring out the entire story. He listened without interruption, his silence a stark contrast to my family's defensive reactions 6 months earlier. "What are you thinking?" he finally asked when I'd finished. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me is still angry. He chose his pride and Kenneth's manipulation over trusting his own daughter. And the other part?" I sighed. "The other part remembers he's still my father, that he's human and made terrible mistakes he can't undo, that even though what he did was wrong, Kenneth expertly exploited his weaknesses." "Do you want my opinion?" Michael asked carefully. "Please. It sounds like your father is finally facing consequences for his actions. That's important. But it also sounds like he's genuinely remorseful and trying to make amends. That's important too. So what does that mean for me? What should I do?" "That's not for me to say," Michael replied. "But I know you, Cassandra. You've built your business around helping companies act with integrity. Whatever decision you make should reflect your own values, not just your hurt or anger." His words stayed with me through a restless night. The next morning, I called Professor Carter, hoping her ethical perspective might bring clarity. "He's made the first step," she said after I'd explained the situation, "admitting wrongdoing and accepting consequences. That matters. But is it enough?" I asked. "After everything he did?" "Enough for what? For legal absolution? That's not up to you. For family reconciliation? That depends on what you want and need." "I'm not sure what I want." "Then start with what you know," she advised. "What facts are you certain of?" I considered carefully. The company is in crisis. Hundreds of employees could lose their jobs if it fails completely. The investigation is ongoing, with or without my involvement. My father seems genuinely remorseful. My family is suffering. And what are your core values? The principles that guide your decisions? Integrity, honesty, accountability. I paused, then added, compassion. "There's your framework," Professor Carter said gently. "Your decision should honor all of those values, not just some." After our call, I spent hours researching the status of the investigation into Morgan Construction. Public records confirmed what my father had told me. Kenneth Barrett had disappeared, presumably fleeing the country. The company faced multiple investigations and lawsuits. Several news articles mentioned layoffs and project cancellations. One particularly detailed piece noted that over 200 employees' livelihoods were at risk. 200 families facing uncertainty because of Kenneth's greed and my father's weakness. My phone rang, displaying Brandon's number. I hesitated before answering. "Cassie?" My brother's voice sounded different, lighter somehow, despite the circumstances. "Brandon, Dad said you were in Nashville." "I am. Playing open mics, working on my music. Should have done it years ago." He paused. "Dad came to see you?" "Yesterday. Told me everything." "Yeah. He finally came clean with all of us." After Kenneth disappeared, Brandon's voice turned serious. "The company's in real trouble, Cass. Dad's cooperating with investigators, but the damage is extensive. Clients pulling out, banks freezing credit lines. Why are you calling me about this? You know I left the company because you're the only one who saw it coming, the only one who tried to stop it, and maybe the only one who can help save the employees who had nothing to do with any of it." The request took me by surprise. "You want me to come back?" "Just to help navigate the crisis. You understand the business better than anyone. You have relationships with the clients and banks that I don't." He hesitated. "Dad suggested stepping back completely, letting you take interim control if you're willing." "I don't know, Brandon. After everything that happened." "I get it," he interrupted. "I failed you too. I should have backed you up that night. I was a coward." His frank admission touched me. "You were caught in the middle. Still am in some ways. But I've realized life's too short to live for someone else's dream. Nashville's mine. The company was yours. You were the one who really cared about it, about Grandpa's legacy." He paused. "Think about it, okay? Not for Dad. For the employees. For what the company could be without Kenneth's influence." After we hung up, I drove to the cemetery where my grandfather was buried. I hadn't visited since before the confrontation with my father, feeling somehow that I'd failed to protect what he'd built. Sitting beside his grave, I traced the engraving on his headstone: William Morgan, builder of dreams and character. "What would you do, Grandpa?" I whispered. "How do you protect what matters most when everything's so broken?" No divine answer came, but as I sat there, I remembered conversations we'd had about difficult business decisions, about balancing profit with people, about second chances and redemption. On the drive back, I took a detour past the Morgan Construction headquarters. The building still stood proud, but the parking lot was half empty, a visible sign of the layoffs already implemented. As I idled at a stoplight, I noticed a woman leaving the building, carrying a box of personal items to her car. Margaret Collins, the office manager who'd been with the company since my grandfather's days, whose 3 children had college funds thanks to the generous benefits package he'd insisted upon. Without thinking, I pulled over and called out to her. Margaret's face registered surprise, then warmth. "Cassandra, it's wonderful to see you. I heard about the layoffs. I'm so sorry." She set the box down on her car hood. "Not your fault. Everyone knows you tried to warn them." "Are you?" "Part of the reduction, yes. 27 years. She smiled sadly. "But I'll land on my feet. My concern is for the younger ones with mortgages, children, student loans. How bad is it inside?" "Bad. Morale's rock bottom. Nobody trusts leadership anymore. Projects stalled. Contractors unpaid." She studied me. "You thinking of coming back?" "I don't know," Brandon called. "Asked me to consider it." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Your grandfather built something special here. Not just buildings, but a community. People who took pride in their work, who looked out for each other." She gestured toward the building. "That's worth saving, even if some of the people at the top lost their way." Her words resonated with something inside me. The company was bigger than my father's mistakes or Kenneth's crimes. It was hundreds of people, countless completed projects, my grandfather's vision of ethical construction. Back at my apartment, I pulled out a legal pad and began preparing a presentation outlining what I would need to consider returning. Complete transparency with investigators. Establishment of an independent ethics committee. Full restitution to defrauded clients. Protection for whistleblowers. Structural changes to prevent future abuses of power. I wasn't committing yet, but I was considering it not out of family obligation, but because sometimes integrity meant staying to fix what was broken rather than walking away with clean hands. As I worked late into the night, weighing moral complexities and practical solutions, I realized I was thinking more clearly than I had in months. The anger that had clouded my judgment was receding, replaced by a focused determination to do what was right, not just what felt righteous. The next morning, I called Brandon back. "I'll meet with the family," I said. "No promises beyond that, and I have conditions." "Name them," he replied, relief evident in his voice. "Not over the phone, in person, all of you together. I'll fly back tomorrow. I'll tell the others." That evening, I prepared to return to the place I'd been told never to come back to. As I dressed for the meeting, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The woman looking back was neither the dutiful daughter who'd left in anger 6 months ago, nor the wounded exile who'd rebuilt her life alone. She was something else entirely, stronger, clearer, more centered in her own authority. For the first time in my life, I was making choices based not on family expectations or professional ambition, but on my own moral compass. Whatever happened next, I would be guided by values that were truly mine. I arrived at the family home precisely at 7, the manila folder containing my conditions tucked under my arm like armor. As I walked up the familiar path to the front door, I felt strangely calm. This house no longer had power over me. I was coming back not as a supplicant seeking restoration to the family, but as my own person offering conditional help to those who had once rejected me. The difference was subtle but profound. I wonder if you've ever returned to a place or relationship with completely new terms. It takes courage to walk back through doors that once closed behind you. If you're finding value in this journey we're on together, please tap that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. As we head into the final chapters of this story, I'd love to know if you've ever had to rebuild trust with family after a major betrayal. Share your experiences in the comments below. The front door opened before I could ring the bell. My mother stood there, looking smaller than I remembered, her perfectly maintained appearance showing subtle signs of strain, an uncharacteristic wrinkle in her blouse, slightly smudged mascara. "Cassandra?" she breathed, as though saying my name might cause me to vanish. She reached out tentatively, then pulled back, uncertain of her welcome. "Hi, Mom," I said, surprised by the emotion tightening my throat. She stepped aside to let me in, maintaining a careful distance. "Everyone's in the dining room." Of course they were. The same room where everything had fallen apart 6 months ago. As I followed her through the familiar hallway, I noticed small changes in the house. Missing artwork, fewer fresh flower arrangements, a general sense of reduced opulence. The financial strain was apparently hitting home in very literal ways. The scene in the dining room struck me immediately with its contrast to that fateful night. Instead of a lavish dinner with crystal and fine china, the large table held only a carafe of water and some legal pads. Instead of family members dressed for a celebration, my father, Brandon, and Melanie sat in casual clothes, tension evident in their postures. Brandon rose immediately when I entered, coming forward to embrace me awkwardly. "Thanks for coming, Cass." My father remained seated, his expression both hopeful and apprehensive. "Cassandra, we appreciate you being willing to meet with us." Melanie didn't look up at all, her gaze fixed on her hands folded tightly in her lap. I took a seat at the opposite end of the table from my father, a deliberate choice to position myself as an equal, not a subordinate returning to the fold. "Before we begin," I said, "I want to be clear about something. I'm here to discuss the company situation, not to pretend the past 6 months didn't happen. I haven't made any decisions about my involvement going forward." Dad nodded. "Understood. We're grateful you're even considering helping." "I'm not doing it for you," I said flatly. "I'm thinking about the employees, the clients, the projects that innocent people depend on." "Fair enough," Dad conceded. "Would you like to hear where things stand currently?" I nodded, and for the next 30 minutes, he outlined the company's situation with a frankness that would have been unimaginable before. Kenneth had embezzled approximately $12 million over 3 years. 9 major clients had suspended or canceled contracts. The company had already laid off 20% of the workforce, with more cuts looming. 3 banks had frozen credit lines pending resolution of the fraud investigation. The family had begun liquidating personal assets to cover immediate obligations. "We're cooperating fully with authorities," Dad explained. "I've provided complete documentation of my involvement and signed a plea agreement." "The terms?" I asked. 2 years. Likely reduced to 9 months with good behavior. 5 years probation, financial penalties. His voice remained steady, but I could see the cost of this admission in the tight lines around his eyes. "I'll begin serving the sentence in approximately 3 months." It was strange to hear my father, the man who had always seemed untouchable, calmly discussing his impending incarceration. Despite everything, I felt a reluctant respect for his willingness to face consequences. "What about the Pittsburgh incident? The injured workers? I've made financial arrangements for them, substantial ones, beyond what insurance covered. And I've reached out personally to apologize." He met my eyes directly. "It doesn't undo the harm, but it's what I can do now." I turned to Melanie, who had still not looked at me. "And your involvement with Kenneth and Eagle Point Enterprises?" She flinched at Kenneth's name. When she finally raised her eyes, I was struck by how much younger and more vulnerable she appeared without her usual perfect makeup and confident demeanor. "I didn't know about the embezzlement." "Not really," she said quietly. "Kenneth told me Eagle Point was a legitimate consulting firm that would give me experience outside the family business. I signed papers without really understanding them. I trusted him." Her voice cracked slightly. "I was stupid." "Not stupid," I corrected. "Manipulated. There's a difference." Surprise flickered across her face at my lack of recrimination. "Kenneth was skilled at finding people's vulnerabilities and exploiting them," I continued. "He did it to Dad with the Pittsburgh incident. He did it to you by offering attention and validation." "I should have listened to you," Melanie admitted. "The night you confronted everyone, part of me knew you might be right. But I couldn't bear to believe it, to admit I'd been so completely fooled. This honest acknowledgement from my proud, defensive sister was perhaps the most surprising development of the evening. Brandon spoke next, explaining his role in recent months. I've been meeting with key clients, trying to maintain relationships. Some are willing to stick with us if we can demonstrate new leadership and transparency measures. Which brings us to why we asked you here, Dad said. I'll be stepping down as CEO immediately, regardless of your decision. The board of directors has suggested you as interim CEO while I'm away, with a path to permanent appointment if desired. The directness of the offer took me by surprise. You're prepared to turn the company over to me? After everything? You're the only logical choice, Dad replied matter-of-factly. You understand the business completely. You have credibility with investigators because you tried to expose the problems. Most importantly, you have the integrity the company needs right now. I opened my manila folder and distributed copies of the document I'd prepared. These are my conditions for even considering the position. They read in silence. The conditions were extensive and non-negotiable. Complete financial transparency, including regular external audits, establishment of an independent ethics committee with real authority, structural changes to eliminate opportunities for financial manipulation, protection for whistleblowers, leadership training for all executives, commitment to ethical business practices even at the cost of growth or profit, and no special treatment or positions for family members without proper qualifications. This last point, Dad said, tapping the page, would affect Melanie's position. Yes, I acknowledged, looking at my sister. It would. To my surprise, Melanie nodded. It's fair. I didn't earn my position. I was given it because I was a Morgan. I'm not saying you couldn't earn a position, I clarified. Just that it would need to be based on merit and appropriate qualifications. I understand, she hesitated. Actually, I've been thinking about going back to school. Maybe get an MBA like you did. Do things properly this time. This glimpse of maturity from my previously entitled sister was yet another unexpected outcome of the family crisis. Mom spoke up for the first time since we'd entered the dining room. What about family relationships? Are those part of your conditions too? I considered her question carefully. No. Those would need to develop separately from business arrangements. Trust takes time to rebuild. She nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears. But you're open to trying? To rebuilding? I'm here, aren't I? The meeting continued for several hours as we discussed practical matters, immediate financial needs, communications with employees and clients, transition plans. By the end, I hadn't committed to accepting the CEO position, but I had agreed to come to the office the following day to assess the situation firsthand. That first day back at Morgan Construction was surreal. Employees I'd worked with for years greeted me with a mixture of surprise, hope, and wariness. The executive floor, once bustling with activity, felt eerily quiet. Kenneth's former office sealed with evidence tape, several other offices empty following resignations and layoffs. I spent the morning reviewing financial records, meeting with department heads, and speaking with the company's legal counsel about ongoing investigations. The damage was even more extensive than I'd realized, but not irreparable. In the afternoon, I gathered the remaining employees in the main conference room and spoke directly about the situation. No corporate spin, no false reassurances, just honest assessment of both challenges and possibilities. Mistakes were made at the highest levels of this company, I told them. Trust was broken. Values were compromised. I can't promise that everyone's job is secure or that recovery will be quick and painless. What I can promise is complete transparency going forward. You'll know exactly where we stand, good or bad. The response was cautiously positive. People appreciated honesty after months of evasive corporate communications. Over the following weeks, I implemented the changes outlined in my conditions document. The Independent Ethics Committee included respected industry figures with no ties to the Morgan family. Financial processes were restructured to require multiple approvals for significant transactions. A whistleblower hotline was established with protection guarantees for those reporting concerns. Slowly, tentatively, trust began to rebuild both within the company and within my family. I had several difficult conversations with my father as he prepared for his incarceration, discussing everything from practical business matters to deeper issues of betrayal and reconciliation. These discussions weren't easy, but they were necessary for moving forward with clear understanding rather than unresolved resentment. One evening, Melanie asked to meet for coffee, the first time we'd spent time together outside family or business settings in years. She arrived without her usual armor of designer clothes and perfect makeup, looking younger but somehow more authentically herself. "I've started therapy," she announced without preamble, trying to understand why I was so desperate for validation that I fell for someone like Kenneth. "Why I've always been so competitive with you." "And?" I prompted when she paused. She smiled ruefully. "Turns out growing up as the pretty one while your sister is the smart one does a number on your self-worth. I never felt I could compete with you intellectually, so I leaned into being the charming, social daughter instead." "I envied you too, you know," I admitted. "How easily you won people over. How Dad smiled when you walked into a room. I always had to earn his approval with achievement. We were both trying so hard to be what we thought he wanted." Melanie stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "I've applied to business school. For real this time. Not because Dad expects it or to compete with you. Because I want to understand what I'm doing, instead of faking my way through." This new, reflective version of my sister felt like someone I might actually be able to form a relationship with. Brandon, meanwhile, had found an unexpected compromise. He returned to Morgan Construction part-time, handling client relations where his natural charm was an asset. The rest of his time he devoted to music, playing local venues, and even recording some original songs. The divided focus seemed to make him happier and more effective in both areas. Mom surprised everyone by starting a foundation focused on ethics in business, a direct response to the crisis we'd experienced. After decades of supporting Dad's vision without question, she was finally developing one of her own. As for my father, in the weeks before his incarceration began, I saw him working tirelessly to make amends wherever possible. He personally visited clients who'd been defrauded, offering no excuses, only apologies and restitution. He met with employees who'd been laid off, using personal funds to extend their severance packages. He wrote detailed documentation of company operations to ensure continuity during his absence. The night before he was scheduled to report to the minimum security facility, he asked to meet with me privately at his office. "I've signed the papers," he said, sliding a document across his desk. "Effective immediately, you're CEO of Morgan Construction. Not interim, not temporary. It's yours now." I looked at the papers without touching them. "Are you sure?" "More sure than I've been about anything in a long time." He gazed around the office that had been his domain for 35 years. "I built this company into something impressive, but somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what really mattered. Integrity, relationships, the legacy beyond buildings and balance sheets." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the skyline, dotted with structures Morgan Construction had built. "Your grandfather would be proud of you, Cassandra. You're continuing his true legacy, not just the business he started." He turned to face me. "I'm proud of you too. More than I can say." The next morning, he reported to begin serving his sentence, head held high, accepting responsibility for his actions. It wasn't a perfect ending. There were still legal challenges, financial hurdles, and family wounds healing slowly, but it was an honest one. And that perhaps was the beginning of our family's true redemption. 1 year after my father's confession at my apartment door, I stood at the window of the CEO's office, my office, now watching the sunset paint the city skyline in shades of amber and gold. Several of those gleaming towers bore the Morgan Construction seal, tangible reminders of our company's impact on the physical landscape. But it was the less visible changes of the past year that occupied my thoughts that evening. Morgan Construction had survived, though in a markedly different form. We were smaller now, having sold off certain divisions to pay restitution and settle lawsuits. Our workforce had contracted by nearly 30% through necessary layoffs and voluntary departures. Our profit margins were thinner as we rebuilt our reputation through transparent practices and ethical pricing. Yet in many ways, we were stronger. The clients who remained with us did so out of genuine trust, not just contractual obligation. The employees who stayed brought renewed commitment and pride to their work. The new ethics committee had become a respected industry model, with other construction firms adopting similar structures. My father had served 8 months of his sentence before being released on good behavior. His return to civilian life had been quietly dignified, no press conferences, no dramatic gestures, just a man accepting the consequences of his actions and working to rebuild broken trust one day at a time. He declined to return to the company in any official capacity, instead focusing on community service and mentoring young entrepreneurs about ethical business practices, teaching them what not to do, as he put it wryly during one of our weekly lunch meetings. Mother had flourished in her new role, leading the business ethics foundation she'd established. After decades of defining herself primarily as Richard Morgan's wife, she'd discovered her own voice and passion. The foundation's scholarship program, providing business education to underprivileged students with an emphasis on ethical leadership, had already gained national recognition. Melanie was halfway through her MBA program, approaching her studies with a seriousness that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. Kenneth's betrayal had broken something in her, but from that breaking had emerged a stronger, more authentic person. She occasionally consulted on marketing projects for the company, bringing fresh perspectives without the entitlement that had previously characterized her involvement. Brandon had found his balance, splitting his time between client relations work and music. His band had developed a local following, and he seemed happier than I'd ever seen him. I needed permission to want something different, he told me once, to not have to be the Morgan son following the Morgan path. As for me, the past year had transformed me in ways both professional and personal. I'd grown into the CEO role, learning to balance authority with humility, confidence with openness to feedback. I'd developed my own leadership style, distinct from my father's command and control approach or my grandfather's paternalistic benevolence. My relationship with Michael had deepened through the challenges. He'd stood beside me during the tumultuous early days of taking over the company, offering support without trying to influence my decisions. 6 months ago, he'd moved into my apartment, bringing a warmth and partnership I'd never experienced in previous relationships. He understood ambition without being threatened by it, valued success without defining it purely in financial terms. Last month, he'd met my family for the first time at a small dinner gathering. I'd watched nervously as he interacted with them, worried about resurfacing tensions or awkward moments. Instead, I'd witnessed something unexpected: authentic connection. Dad and Michael discussing sustainable building materials. Mom asking thoughtful questions about Michael's affordable housing projects. Melanie and Brandon drawing him into their good-natured sibling banter. Observing them together, I realized that cutting my family off completely hadn't been the end of our relationship, but rather the painful beginning of a more honest one. The old dynamics of power, appearance, and conditional acceptance had been shattered, allowing something healthier to emerge from the wreckage. That's not to say everything was perfect. Dad still occasionally slipped into old habits of trying to control situations. Mom sometimes retreated into social niceties when conversations became too emotionally demanding. Melanie could be prickly about perceived criticism. Brandon sometimes avoided conflict that needed addressing. And I still maintained certain boundaries that might never come down completely. But we were trying, actually trying, not just performing family harmony while ignoring deeper issues. I'd installed my grandfather's portrait in my office as a daily reminder of what truly mattered. His steady gaze seemed to follow me as I moved through the space, silently asking if each decision aligned with the values he'd instilled. Today marked a significant milestone, the anniversary of my grandfather's birthday. The family had gathered at his favorite restaurant for a private memorial dinner. As we concluded the meal, my father had risen unexpectedly to speak. A year ago, I wouldn't have had the right to propose this toast, he began, his voice steady but humble. I betrayed not only this company and this family, but the principles my father built them upon. The table fell silent, everyone acknowledging the truth of his words. William Morgan believed that buildings were important not because they displayed wealth or power, but because they provided spaces for human lives to unfold. Homes where families grew, schools where children learned, hospitals where healing happened. Dad's gaze traveled around the table, resting briefly on each face. He measured success not by profit margins, but by the integrity of the work and the well-being of those who did it. He turned to me. Cassandra saw that when the rest of us lost sight of it. She had the courage to stand alone for what was right, even when it cost her everything she'd worked for. His voice caught slightly. When I told her not to come back, it was the greatest mistake of my life. But it was also, strangely, the beginning of our salvation as a family and as a company. He raised his glass. To William Morgan's true legacy. Not the buildings that bear our name, but the values that guide our actions. And to Cassandra, who protected what mattered most when the rest of us couldn't see it. As glasses clinked around the table, I felt a complex surge of emotions. Pride in what we'd salvaged from near disaster, lingering sadness for what had been lost, cautious hope for what might still be built. Later that evening, back in my apartment with Michael, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me here. "Do you ever regret cutting them off?" he asked as we sat on the balcony, watching city lights twinkle in the distance. Taking such a drastic step? I considered his question carefully. No. It was necessary. We'd created a dynamic where truth couldn't be spoken, where appearance mattered more than integrity. Sometimes you have to break something completely before you can rebuild it properly. But you came back. On different terms. As myself, not as the dutiful daughter desperate for approval. I smiled at him. Leaving wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something more honest. Michael nodded thoughtfully. A family defined by values instead of blood or business. Exactly. I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling a peace I'd rarely experienced in my former life. There's no perfect resolution to something like this. Just people honestly working through the damage, trying to do better. And that, perhaps, was the greatest lesson of the past 18 months. That forgiveness required both justice and mercy, that redemption was possible but not easy, that integrity sometimes meant standing alone but could ultimately bring people together on firmer ground. The company would continue to face challenges. The family would still navigate complicated dynamics. But we would do so with clearer vision and stronger values than before. Sometimes you have to leave to truly come home. Have you ever had to make difficult choices to protect your integrity, even when it meant standing against your own family? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. Family relationships can be the most challenging to navigate, especially when business and money are involved. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more stories about family dynamics, ethical dilemmas, and finding your own path. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. And I hope the lessons from my experience might help you navigate your own complicated family dynamics. Remember, standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it in the end. Sometimes the hardest part of any family conflict is knowing when to draw boundaries and when to offer second chances. In my case, cutting them off wasn't the end. It was the necessary reset that allowed us to build something healthier. The journey taught me that true family legacy isn't measured in buildings or bank accounts, but in the values we uphold even when it's difficult. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more authentic family stories. I'd be so grateful if you'd share your own experiences with family betrayal and reconciliation in the comments below. Knowing we're not alone in these struggles can be incredibly healing. And if you know someone who might benefit from hearing this story, please consider sharing it with them. Until next time, remember that integrity isn't just about being right, it's about doing right, even when it costs you everything you thought mattered.